Welcome to a very special edition of Rise Up. This is a new episode. We're going to take a deep dive into the topic of being financially prepared for a catastrophe, a disaster, be it hurricanes, be it floods, fires, everything that's going on in our country. We want you to be prepared for this financially, emotionally, and physically. It could be an epidemic or it could be a personal catastrophe, something you just didn't expect. My name's Terri Kallsen. I'm a managing partner here at Rise Growth. I'm a certified financial planner helping clients with these types of decisions. I'm also the chair-elect for the CFP board. I want to introduce you to my co-host, Joe Duran, who's a managing partner and chief investment officer at Rise Growth. He was also a partner at Goldman and a CFA, as well as the CEO of one of the largest fiduciary RIAs in this country, who is a serial entrepreneur. We also have Scott Schwartz. He's a principal at Bleakly Financial Group. He's a wealth manager, a certified financial planner for more than 30 years. He also spends a lot of time helping clients prepare for the unexpected. So thank you so much, Joe and Scott, for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Terri. It's great to be here on a relatively somber topic.
It is a somber topic, but it is a reality and seems to be a more recurring reality for so many consumers and something that we can really start to help prepare for in many categories. So Joe, in our second episode, you talked about this and some of the things we should have on our A list. So let's begin with the A list.
Before we get into that, I just want to say our hearts go out to everybody who lost their homes, had their lives upended. And that's why we're doing this episode, because I have a lot of personal friends who lost their homes. Some of them have their homes, but they're in the middle of war zones now. In both the Palisades, where people were extremely well off, to places like Altadena, where people are regular middle working class, with $300,000 homes. So I do want to point out the Palisades fire's gotten most of the attention. A lot of the attention was not paid to what happened in Pasadena and Altadena. And I do want to point out, we tend to, as human beings, think about the good things that are going to happen. We sometimes think about some bad things happening. We seldom prepare for catastrophic things happening. And when you have a crisis, being prepared can make the difference between making it through okay or not. And there's some very simple milestones that you need to think about. So what we want to do in this episode is talk practically with a checklist of these are the things you need to have thought about, that you can spend an hour just sitting with your spouse, your loved ones, with your business partners and say, do we have these things covered? We're going to talk about how to actually implement solutions and how to think about things. Because again, we're not going to solve, you can't be prepared when turmoil hits, none of us expect it. And I'll just share, I had a friend in the Palisades. He saw the fires on the ridge. He did not take into account the 100-mile-an-hour winds. He was talking with his spouse about, hey, what do we do? What should we be taking? Should we be getting ready? California, we're ready, always ready for earthquakes. But earthquakes, you can still rubble through stuff to get your stuff out. You don't think about something coming along and burning everything. And while he's talking about with his wife, the lights went out. And 2 seconds later, the police said, you need to evacuate. And he was making decisions with his spouse about what they could fit in their car. They're grabbing clothes. I need sweat shoes, I need socks, I need underwear. And he's not thinking, oh, I can replace all of that at Gap. I need to take my wife's really nice stuff. And these kinds of things, again, some forethought, being prepared can change everything. It's actually the difference between managing through and being chaotic well after the crisis hits. So again, we have a very practical approach. I know, Scott, you've had a lot of experience with this in your lifetime as a financial planner. Any thoughts you want to add before we get into the A list?
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a client whose home was burned down to the ground. He was up in Pacific Palisades. We've talked several times since that happened. One of the gratifying things was, we do spend time with our clients, and we're not in the casualty insurance business, but it's one of the things on our checklist. And in going through that, he was very well covered. He's had an extremely good experience, actually, with his insurance company. He's in great shape. He's already been relocated into a rental property. He's got a big chunk of money in the bank that, believe it or not, the insurance company's already sent him a check for about 80%.
Wow.
So yeah, and so that's what we're all focused on now because of the fires. But our orientation has always been more about other things, reviewing documents, wills, trusts. That's the funny thing. We all know we're going to die. We just don't know when. For some of us, it's way closer than for others. So again, not knowing when a fire might occur, not knowing when you might be sick or pass or whatever the case may be, it does make sense to sit down from time to time and just review, where am I? What do my coverages look like? What does my life insurance look like? What do my wills and documents look like? So that's part of what we built into our practice at Bleakly, just to make sure that if something does, come up, that we've addressed it.
And we're going to talk today about some just very pragmatic things you can do that don't even require an advisor. An advisor would make this all a lot easier, but let's just talk about the A list.
Right.
And Terri, maybe we'll just start with the A, right?
Yeah, the first letter is A for accountability. What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
Well, first and foremost, when something happens, you need to know who's responsible for what. And so if something happened to me, who needs to make decisions, who has the latitude and the discretion to make those decisions, and in fact, does everybody know that that person has the right to make those decisions? My wife and I went down on a plane unexpectedly. Knock on wood, that never happens. Who makes the decisions? So thinking about not just in your personal life, but your work life as well. If something happened to my spouse, who's accountable for paying the bills? She does everything in our house. I'm almost useless without her. How would that work? And so again, if there's a fire, who's responsible for grabbing what? So being very accountable as to who in the chain of command makes decisions and what discretion do they have to make decisions. For example, how does money get taken out of a bank account if the person who typically takes the money out isn't there? What happens if they can't write checks or wire money for whatever reason? These are very simple things to think about. What would happen if something happened to me or to our home? Who would be responsible and what are they responsible for?
Yeah, Joe, I just want to add to that pragmatically, that's really making sure all your documents are up to date. And that's really power of attorney, making sure you've assigned a financial and medical power of attorney to the people that you trust. And, there's no better day to do that than today because we never know what tomorrow's going to bring. And then the other component is healthcare directives, really including advanced directives for any medical emergencies. Because if your house is on fire, you certainly could be in a certain area where you need healthcare as well. And unless you have that documented, they can't do much. And then making sure, as Scott said, your will and your trusts are clearly reflecting your current beneficiaries. And I can tell you, Joe and Scott, my husband and I, over 31 years of marriage, we moved 8 times during that time with 3 young children. And every time we moved, our first priority was to make sure our will and trust documents were updated and they really reflected what we needed in the new state that we were in.
I mean, people have as trustees of their will, people they're not even friends with anymore. So again, this is just basic hygiene. Obviously, having an advisor, Scott, very helpful in keeping you like that's what an advisor does, right? Help identify who's accountable and be really a moderator to make sure, hey, this is what so and so wants to have done, right?
Yeah, for sure. We talk about that a lot in our practice. Unfortunately, we meet a lot of people after the fact, or I might be working with a client who's got parents who, the planning should have been done 10 or 20 years ago and it never was. So I've seen a lot of, bad outcomes, if you will, because the planning wasn't done. So we got a lot of experience with that.
And again, with aging parents, I know that we're going to have a whole show dedicated to that topic, but having accountability for who's responsible for our aging parents, for making decisions on their behalf should something bad happen, because again, it's the kind of thing that typically gets ignored.
Yeah, Scott, I think about what you said too. There's a lot of people in our lives that are helping advising, right? But do we have an emergency contact list, for example, right? You talked about your friend running out of your house. Do you have the phone number for your advisors, your accountants, your attorneys, your insurance agents? Do you have all that handy? And if you can't access it, can someone have it? Like, we need an emergency contact list. And then we also need to make sure that we have all of our documents in a safe place. When you only have 10 minutes to get out of your house, make sure you have a safety security box, make sure all your clear documents are in there, and that after the fire, hopefully you can go back and access those original documents.
Right.
All right.
I would bet most people don't, Terri, honestly, but I think a lot more people are thinking about it now.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope this show spurs some action, right? Because this is kind of a thankless job until after a disaster happens and people felt prepared. So, Joe, do you want to go on to the indebtedness, the component of indebtedness?
The L, it's liquidity.
Okay.
Liquidity is having money on hand, the safety net. We talk a lot about investing on this show, but one of the things we don't talk about is the importance of liquidity. And lots of asset allocation will talk about equities and fixed income and assets that are illiquid, like alternative investments. The reality is, when you have a crisis, cash is king. And by cash, I mean money you can get to. So it could be in your savings account, can be in the form of actual cash. But in the US, we're very, very comfortable with debt. We often underappreciate liquidity. So one of the things I know, Scott, you talk about with all your clients is, how much money do you need? And having enough of a reserve. Imagine if your house burned down and you don't get your payment, because for many people in California, myself included, fire insurance was canceled. It simply wasn't offered because the state wouldn't allow the insurance companies to charge what they needed to charge to protect themselves. So we're all on a state level, what's called the California Fair Plan. But what happens if they take 6 months to pay out? And I have to live in a house and I have to support my family. What if my business is at home and I can't function? So I always say to people, have a big enough reserve to withstand almost anything, at least 6 months if you can afford it, ideally a year, so that you know it's there and it needs to be accessible by not just you, but everyone in your family who might need it in a case of an emergency. So liquidity, often underappreciated until it's too late.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. 6 to 12 months is part of every financial plan we have. Money in the bank. We're not worried about return. We're not worried about investing that money. We just want to make sure that money is there and available in the event that you are running out of your house and you're waiting on an insurance company. That you can pay the rent or whatever it is that you've got to do, right, for your new sort of temporary circumstance, for sure.
And this is a case too where you should have some cash on hand, right? Because some of the time machines, some of the cash distribution machines, they just won't work in some cases.
My time machine never works, Terri. I can't seem to get it. I try. I still every day get up a day older.
Does it ever? I was going to say it never works, Joe, or it doesn't often work? Because
it does. It works in one direction. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
But I do think having cash on hand, so you've got kids, you've got to get things done. Somebody's got to eat. Having that on hand, not a lot, but enough to get you through maybe 3 to 5 days in case needed, I think is important. All right, let's move on then to the L. Or no,
we had the L, the I, A list.
I need help. I need a spell check here for this A list. Will you help me?
The I is indebtedness.
Okay.
And we, again, are very comfortable taking on debt as a nation. Lots of people have credit card debt. Lots of people have massive mortgages. And these are strategic decisions that debt allows you to enjoy today what you have not yet earned.
Right.
And that's great unless something happens to stop you from earning. And so this is really more of a cautionary tale to me and to everyone. Make sure that you're not taking on so much debt to enjoy life today that you make somebody in your family's life a complete misery if you're not able to pay it off. And you see this often with athletes and celebrities who've taken on massive amounts of debt. Something happens to them. They stop getting work, whatever ends up happening. And now they end up having to go bankrupt because they were living a lifestyle they could not afford today. So again, I'm a huge believer in investing in yourself. I'm a huge believer in investing to enjoy life more, but keep it within moderation. Again, imagine how you'll service that debt if something goes wrong. And often we have personal lines of business of debt that we guarantee personally for our business. And if something happens to us, our family is now left with this massive line of debt that might not be able to fund, because maybe if there's provisions in it, if something happens to you, it has to get paid off immediately. So not knowing not just the debt, but what are the terms of the debt? What happens that would cause it to get called back or not renewed? And so I think you want to be very careful when you take on debt. Again, the banks make it very easy and it makes life a lot nicer, but it needs to be within constraints. Even with your cars, with everything else you're borrowing money on, even having an itemized list of what do we owe, to whom, and making sure that you have that on top. And by the way, it's really important for transparency and for your friends and family to know, okay, these bills still have to get paid, because the worst thing that can happen is you just don't catch it and suddenly you get a foreclosure on something.
Right.
That's right. The other thing, Joe, we haven't really talked about is just evaluating all of your insurance policies and making sure you understand all the riders on those policies as well as a part of this plan, so you know where your liquidity stands.
When you think about indebtedness, by the way, there's on-balance sheet debt, which means things you know about, mortgages, car payments, etc. And then there's off-balance sheet debt. It could be that you're supporting your brother-in-law or you're supporting your cousin, and those liabilities are still a responsibility. Now, they don't have the legal teeth of a liability, but there might be payments to former spouses. Fortunately, I only have one wife, but there are those commitments that you have that are not necessarily on a balance sheet, that a good advisor will help you itemize. Hey, what liabilities do you have that are not a traditional debt, but are still a requirement and a responsibility that you have as a family or as an individual to make sure that you take care of that?
All right, let's move on to the favorite letter now, the S for simplicity.
Look, keeping it easy. We tend to do a lot of things to complicate our lives, some of it to make it better, some of it because it feels great, some of it just because it sounds fun. The reality is that every time you add complexity to your life, whether it's buying a second home or buying a third car or doing all the things that you might want to do, putting your money in very complicated investments, making investments in startup companies, all of that makes your life much harder in a crisis. So I think when you're making decisions that are fundamentally long-term in nature, ask yourself, how does this complicate my life? Because it might make tax returns really difficult to do. There might be commitments of adding more capital that you now don't have the resources to do. So when you're making private equity investments, for example, which again are good by themselves, but if you have a commitment to put $1 million in or $500,000 in, and you've only put in 50,000, now you have to invest another 450,000. What happens? So again, simplicity is really useful for you and for your whole family. And thinking about every time you're doing something that adds complexity, what do we do about it?
It's funny, Joe. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of all the times I've been on the phone with a client or been in a meeting with a client where I've been, Doctor, no, you don't need to buy that house, or no, you don't need that third car, or I really don't think it's a great idea. Why don't you just rent for a while and see if you like, Palm Beach, Florida, before you spend $3 million on a house? I couldn't agree with you more. I think people make their lives way too complicated. And as long as everything's going great, that works. The problem is once there's a little bit of a, nick in the armor, something happens, a catastrophe, a setback with business, whatever the case may be, that's when those decisions really, they're magnified. If they're bad decisions, they become really bad decisions. So yeah, I think people should really try to keep their life simpler. I think they'll be happier. All that complexity just adds stress, gives people too much to think about. So yeah, I would 100% subscribe to that. I've done that in my personal life. I recommend it to my clients. It always worked for me.
I'll give you just a concrete example here. We had a colleague of mine had sold their company for $200 million, then decided he liked car racing and formed a car racing team. Cost him something like $30 million a year. He hung out with billionaires, decided he needed a private jet. Very quickly then decided his home wasn't big enough. Then decided his wife wasn't the right wife.
Right.
Very quickly, literally within 8 years of having $200 million in his bank account after taxes, had nothing.
Right.
Nothing. And again, it's at all levels, thinking about how do I keep this easy?
Right.
Is there a way to do this at a low cost version to see if I even like it?
Right.
Because again, some people like to adjust their lifestyle far too quickly, make their lives really complicated for everyone around them.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the last, which is the T for transparency.
Look, as we've just said, it's really just validating everything we've said, having everything documented, having everyone who knows they're responsible know that they're responsible, knowing that you have an emergency list, knowing that you have clear directives for what happens if certain things occur. Transparency means having an update on an ongoing basis. This is one of the most valuable things. If you have an advisor, a lawyer, somebody who's an outside party to advise you, they keep the records and people can go, does anyone have what the rules of engagement are? And that's certainly what a team like Scott's and all of the advisors that work there do. Something that, of course, your own advisor should be doing is the first phone call would happen for me and my family is they call my advisor at Goldman, at ACO and say, hey, what do we need to do? Because there's transparency around where everything is. So having a very clear place where everything is available and accessible, and ideally a third party that can help you to navigate things so that you don't have any conflicts of interest, somebody you can trust to do the right thing so that there's continuation of your wishes, whatever they are, whether you're able to make those decisions or not is very, very useful. And again, all of these things are things that you can do literally over the course of an hour. And we'll just talk specifically about what you need to do. Go through this A list, which we've itemized, and on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing? That would be one way to do it. The other way to do it is say, how bad are we on a scale of 1 to 10? So choose either one. And then the things that you're underperforming in. Hey, we don't have enough liquidity. What do we need to do to get this from a 2 to an 8? If we have a lot of risk in, hey, we do not have transparency. We don't have everything documented in one place. Just take the things that you're really underperforming in and make some specific actions you can take to make it better and commit to it. Like this is like a New Year's resolution, just so that every step you take, every little thing you do will make your life immeasurably better if at the worst thing should happen to you. So again, thinking carefully about how do I make this better? So what first thing I do is take the A list, go through this. We'll put up, we'll attach somewhere, I hope, on our YouTube channel, a thing you can download that breaks down this A list very simply. And then just score yourself on a scale 1 to 10, you and your family members, you and the decision makers in your life. You can even do this for a business. We do this for ourselves and say, okay, where are we and how do we improve this score? And take the ones that you're most deficient in and do something about it.
Yeah, I think about T as well for testing. And really what you were saying is we're going to test ourselves and how well prepared we are. And, you know, I had 3 little kids at one point, and we used to actually test our disaster response program. I'm kind of one of those weird moms, but, you know, we had a 2-story house. And we had little ladders that they would have to put out their window if we had a fire. And then we had a certain tree that we would meet at, because at the end of the fire, make sure everyone was accountable and was there. And so we tested our capabilities. Now, luckily, we never actually had to use it, but it certainly helped me sleep better knowing that I was testing some of the components of your A list.
Very good.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope everyone found this very helpful. We don't know when the next disaster or catastrophe will happen, but we know we can be better prepared for it.
And let's hope it never happens for you.
Yes.
So that you never, ever have to use any of this.
That's exactly right. And, you know, hopefully you've seen this. If you have questions, please send them in. Go to our YouTube website, share your comments, share your perspectives, and subscribe to join us again next week.